and just doing what he knew he had to do. That spirit is very, very rare. A man of those gifts, a supreme intelligence, a very deep faith, a total integrity, a great sense of humor, a little bit corny, but great, and just a folksy, down-home guy who would be absolutely relentless in pursuit of his goal. This guy interviewed terrorists. He interrogated terrorists. And he told me about how he used to do it, He says, you don't have to threaten these guys. You don't have to do anything. You just talk to them about a few things. There's a few keywords that turn them on, and they want to talk. And you can imagine Phil just sitting there going with a nice smile on his face, very friendly demeanor. Look, Abdul, tell us about Al-Qaeda. What did you do? Tell us about your training camp and who you targeted and what you're going to do. And they go, yeah, right, Phil. I'll spill my guts, no problem. Because he had a way of being very hard to be angry with, very hard to be antagonistic to. He was just so humble and so decent and so obviously intelligent and a caring individual. He was relentless. He was there to protect his country. He was there to stop the bad guys. But he never talked about these people like some do, like these are towelheads, these are scumbags. He understood they were human beings guided by very mistaken beliefs.
Right.
And if you dealt with them as an individual, even the most hardened of them could be reached to at least some degree. And he taught me a lot about that, the humility that goes with a job like that. There was no ego with Phil whatsoever. None whatsoever. And he just was there. He was the ultimate patriot. He had total courage, total integrity, total faith, total confidence in the rightness of his cause, and a very deep humanity. Now, this is very, very clear. A lot of you probably met his first wife, Francesca. Now, she was Phil's childhood sweetheart. They met in not childhood, but in college. I think their first years in college back in Northern California, And Phil was a bit of a hippie then, and Francesca was, probably a bit of a flower child. But they met and they bonded, and they were together ever since. And I met Francesca on a few occasions, and I met Phil with Francesca, without Francesca. And you could tell he was absolutely devoted to that woman. Absolutely, 100% commitment. And when she got cancer, and I was there having a barbecue meal out in California, Southern California, when he got the phone call from her confirming that her tests were positive, and obviously suspected that she had something, came back that she had a serious cancer. You could tell he was affected by it, but he came back and he talked through the rest of the meal with us. And I didn't know at that time that's the news he'd got. He only told me later that that's when he found out at that meal. But he just kept on going. He would have been shaken to the core, but he just kept on the appearances, kept the meal. Didn't look for sympathy. Didn't say woe is me or anything. I wouldn't have known. I knew there was sort of something, but I certainly didn't know anything of that gravity or that import. And but that typified Phil. He was not a histrionics guy. He was not a dramatist, but he was a man of deep, deep spiritual faith and deep, deep love. You could tell he loved Francesca like no one else. That was a match for 40 years. And he would often talk to me, after she had gone, and I remember, he phoned me about 2 days before she died, and he said, look, she's turning the corner. She's had some treatment and she's looking better. And I was in Florida at the top of an observation tower looking at trying to find manatees, and I get a phone call, and it was Phil, and he said, "Look, buddy, Francesca died this morning. Francesca just died." And I was pretty shocked because, I thought, well, she's looking good, looking better. Things were looking up. But we know that often happens. People will rally a little bit before the last. And he was, you could tell he was upset, but he was, he was just telling a friend what had happened. And he was very matter of fact about it. I talked to him several times after that, over the months, and he would often express his grief and, I really super miss her, and life's not the same. So I was pretty pleased when he, about a year after that, he met another love, and a lady from California, and he was sort of like a schoolboy, he was sort of like, I couldn't quite believe this was the Phil I knew. He was telling, I've been writing songs, I've been writing poems. I didn't know he wrote songs. I didn't know he wrote poems. I've been writing songs and poems, and I've met this lady, and look, it's going pretty good. And, we've formed a bit of a romance has gone on. And a very sort of, this was like a very innocent schoolboy. That's how I was, it was very, very touching. There's nothing cynical about it, or oh, she's pretty nice, she's gorgeous, It was just a very calm, very deep thing that you could see. He hadn't got over Francesca, and she would never be replaced. But people have to realize that there's new people there for us, and he was looking forward to that, looking forward to developing that relationship. And I didn't know till after his death, but because I didn't talk to him for a couple of weeks, or probably 3 weeks before he died, that on Valentine's Day, he'd actually proposed to her. So he'd actually popped the question, and I was very happy to hear that. I was very, very happy, because I thought this is a guy who deserves a companion, someone of his stature, someone of his beliefs and of his faith, that he can share things with, because Phil loved to share. He was very unselfish with his knowledge. He didn't try and, as some people do, I've got secret knowledge and I'm not letting it out to anybody. He was just there to do the mission, to save the country, to save his faith, to save what he believed in. And he would do anything for that, anything. And so I was really pleased that he'd met this new lady, and I thought, wow, it just shows, there's hope for everybody. You go through Phil's gone through a lot. He's gone through this battle with the government, touring the country for 4 years, just hammering on to trying to get people to wake up, being tantalized with being drawn back into the Department of Homeland Security, which should have happened straight after Trump was elected, but, it didn't, unfortunately. And I thought, then he had to deal with losing the love of his life, to cancer, not just a sudden disease like a heart attack, watching her slowly fade over several months, knowing that it was around the corner, and knowing that no matter what they did, the chances were against her. They could hope for a miracle, they could hope for extended life, but they knew it was going to be a tough battle all the way. Now, I can't imagine what that's like. I've had people close to me die suddenly, but I've never had to go through somebody dying of a long, drawn-out degenerative disease. I'm sure most people listening to me have. I've been lucky. I've never had that, and I can't imagine what it would have been like. But Phil never faltered. You could tell he was a bit stressed. You could tell it was hard on him, but he always had an air of optimism. He always had a smile. You could tell when he talked about Francesca, he was deeply worried, but it didn't get on top of him because he had that faith. Nobody had faith like Phil Haney. It was very, very deep and very real to him. And he would often express it to me. He wasn't a huge proselytizer, but he was always willing to share. And, you know, I'm sure he made a lot of difference to a lot of people and a lot of deep conversations. So he'd be the kind of guy, I'm sure, shared a lot with other people in grief. And no matter what he was going through, I'm sure he always had time for others and what they were going through. You know, Phil taught me a few things. You know, he was an entomologist, right? You know, he went from being an entomologist, studying insects, going all over the world. He'd go. That's how he knew Islam, not Islam, Arabic, because he'd actually been to places like Yemen, studying plagues. You know, locusts and insects and you know, because they had a lot of problem with those things. So he went to several countries around the world, you know, studying pest insects, how you deal with them. And what he told me, I said, well, how does that line up? How did that get you into Homeland Security? He says, well, it's the same process. If you want to know where a pest or a plague comes from, go back to the nest. Follow it to the nest. And so he would do that with locusts and beetles and or whatever, all these little critters. And when he went into Homeland Security right at the beginning, he applied that same logic to terrorists. Where did these guys come from? Where do they breed? Where do they gather? Where do they learn? Where do they get their ideology from? So he would identify these people and go back from the known to the unknown. He would find them. And he was very successful. He identified over 300 terrorists in this country. And, you know, the Obama administration obviously didn't think that was a very high priority. And because, you know, the armed services still had a homophobia problem at the time. And, you know, transgenders had to be looked after. That was a burning issue where the country had to face. And 300 terrorists had to come very low down the priority lists. So, you know, Phil got himself at odds with his superiors. You know, he got commendation after commendation when he started, because obviously he started under the previous president. But when the new president came into office, the priorities shifted. And the Homeland Security Department started focusing more on white nationalist supremacists, white supremacists and Nazis, you know, all 8 of them.
And vocabulary became very important. The words you could use to control speech and then control thought, obviously. But
yeah, it did, and that shifted. They didn't even, the Department of Homeland Security wasn't even interested hardly in Muslims at all. It was all about homegrown terrorists, white supremacists, neo-Nazis. You know, there's probably about 50 of these people in the country, but they have killed people, like McVeigh killed 100 people. They are dangerous and they should be monitored, but they are nowhere near the threat of Islamic terrorism or even leftist terrorism in this country. So, you know, that showed that Phil wasn't the kind of guy who would just change his course because of a false directive from above. He just kept on doing what he knew was the correct course of action. And he got censured for it. He had to sit in a room for a year with no assigned work to do. You imagine that. You're sitting in a room for a year getting paid with no work while you're being investigated multiple times for doing nothing wrong. Wouldn't that cause you a little bit of stress?
Yeah.
Wouldn't you think? What kind of person could stand up to that?
That is sort of Cool Hand Luke writ large. That's like Cool Hand Luke times 12.
Yeah. The Cool Hand Luke was just a beginner when it comes to that kind of thing.
What we have here is clearly a failure to communicate.
Yeah, yes. Yes, I know the movie, I know the reference. But that's my memories of Phil, you know, and I'm sure there are other things that I could come up with, but my overriding memories was me not really wanting to meet him at that time, because I thought, you know, this is just a hassle. This is just more work, we've almost got the movie done. It's all ready to go. I had my vision on it, and it changed a lot. And every bit of it was for the better because of Phil and the emphasis that he brought to that movie. So I'm eternally grateful to him for that. I'll tell you what, he sold me a lot of movies around the country because wherever he went, he would promote my stuff and what we were doing. And see, this is also the benevolent spirit. You know, some people will try and promote themselves. You know, you got a business to run, and we understand that. We're all got to make a living at this. But he was very generous. You know, he would always promote his, not competition, but other people in the field. You know, he was always very generous with his time. He would be very willing to listen. I never saw a word of rancor out of him. I never saw him lose his temper. I never saw him be snarky with anybody. I'm sure that happened, but I never saw it because he was the just most strongest and gentlest person you could imagine, but fierce as a bulldog in defense of his country and his values. Fierce as a bulldog. You wouldn't want to have Phil on your tail. But you knew when he caught you, he'd treat you fairly, but he'd still get you if you're a bad guy. You know, he had a duty.
Do you remember how seriously he took his oath of office? That at the beginning of nearly every lecture, he would ask who was a member of the military, who was a veteran in the audience, and after the show of hands, he would say, "Is your oath of office, is your oath finished now that you're retired?" And everyone would shake their hands, and he'd say, "Well, of course, once you take the oath and you pledge to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic," and he'd look around the crowd and he'd make everyone realize he's still carrying the mantle of the Office of Homeland Security.
No, nothing changed for Phil. That was, like his marriage vows to Francesca lasted a life. His oath to defend the Constitution lasted his entire lifetime as well. There was never any doubt that it would. You know, he was very, very steadfast. You know, so to sum up, you know, he was a funny guy. His jokes were a little bit corny, but they always made you laugh. I had to think about them sometimes. They're a little bit subtle sometimes. And he was always loyal, always dependable, always even-tempered, always completely patriotic, and just dogged as just like a bulldog. You know, but never boastful, he just the archetypal quiet hero. You know, but he could talk too. He could sing. He could write poems. So he was an artist and a scientist and a patriot and a man of deep faith and just a wonderful guy to know. And you know, I think I just wish I'd got to know him earlier and interacted with him a bit more than I did. And I'm so sorry he's gone. But I know the only thing he wants us to do, the only thing to glorify his memory, is to keep doing what we're doing. That would be his last wish, I'm absolutely sure. So, yeah.
In terms of having suffered a meaningful death, I mean, he's quite blessed. I mean, it's our loss that he's gone. It's his gain. But if anyone could have died a noble death, it would be Phil Haney. If you, in the classical sense, but also in a Christian sense, he really died for the love of his friends in defending America. And you said something earlier about his patience. It's really interesting. One evening after the Trump rally here in Rochester, he had succeeded. You know how he could talk to anyone. He had succeeded in convincing the Secret Service to let him park his large the van unit right next to the Civic Center. So we had a place to rest while we were waiting all night long, and he got us to the front of the line because he made contact with some veterans who were at the front of the line. So we were the first in in the hall that night. But he could talk to anyone, and he after the Trump rally, we were trying to meet up with people at a local bar, and we were driving around looking for a parking spot, and he had no problem driving this massive vehicle down the narrowest of streets, the byways, and he didn't lose his patience at all. There was no road rage about the guy, and I was really embarrassed that I couldn't tell him which way to go up and down which one-way street. But he didn't feel encumbered by that at all.
Yeah, you can't imagine Phil freaking out over a bit of pressure, can you? You know, you can't
Oh,
imagine him stressing out in a traffic jam or, you know, getting worried because the check didn't arrive or, you know, if somebody is just badgering him in a, you know, after a meeting, you never stressed him, always very calm. But it just reminds me though, you know, um, Phil and I did spend a bit of time in Minnesota. And because obviously Minnesota is a frontline state, you got the red and the green big time up there. You got the Islamists and the communists working together to take over that state. So Phil put a lot of time into Minnesota, and I've been there a few times myself. And we did talk about it a few times in different meals around the place, just what a frontline state Minnesota was, and how proud Phil was of the team up there. You know, you got some fantastic activists in that state, you know, that are some of the best in the country, you know, and you know who they are, you know, and they're in the country areas, they're in the cities, they're in the Tea Party groups and the GOP independent operators. But you've got one of the best networks in the country up there to counteract this thing. And I know it's a struggle, but Phil was always very willing to go to Minnesota. He always talked very, very favorably about Minnesota. Probably Minnesota and Michigan were probably his two favorites because of the teams, not because he just loved the state, which I'm sure he did. It's a beautiful place, but because the teams there were so good. And I think, you know, Minnesota being a very Christian state, Minnesota being a very archetypically Midwestern state. The people are honest, the people are good, and they are patriotic. And when they wake up, they're probably more effective and more dedicated than virtually anywhere else. You know, they have a real depth there. And I know Phil appreciated that because we often used to talk about you guys and the team up there, some of the names that you know. They would come up a lot. And so I was shared a little bit of time up in Minnesota with Phil, not as much as I would have liked, but I know it did have a very special place in his heart, and you know, as it does in mine. You know, I've had a lot of met fantastic folks in Minnesota, and we're still rooting for you up there. We really are, and I'm still sure Phil is still rooting for you as well. You know, watching us from where from where he is now. So I want to close out there now. I just want to say it was an honor to know Phil. It was an honor to get to know the people I met through Phil. You know, many of them I met through Phil in Minnesota and others. And I think we did a bit of a complementary thing in Minnesota. I focused more on the red side. He focused more on the green. But Minnesota, they overlap a lot, as they do in Michigan and some other places. So it was great to know Phil. As always, we wish all of us, if we could look now, we would have spent more time with him and taken him even more serious than we did. But we got to be privileged to know what we did, and all of us can draw inspiration from him for the rest for the rest of our lives. All of us can do that. None of us is ever going to forget Phil, ever. And we'll all draw that inspiration as a very exceptional man of exceptional gifts and exceptional character qualities that we can all compare ourselves to when the time gets tough. What would Phil do? How would Phil handle this? You know, so I'm privileged. That will always be with me. I'm sure it'll always be with you, Wes, and the other people watching this who got to know Phil or have got to know Phil even since he died, got to know a little bit about him. So I want to thank you for doing this memorial, Wes. I want to thank all the people involved. You know, it's appropriate that it was done out of Minnesota. I think he probably put more into Minnesota than any other state, and you know, met more people and touched more hearts in that state than any other. So I want to thank you for putting this together. Thank you to all the people from Minnesota watching, but all the people all over America. You know, Phil was an American. He was a Christian. He was a patriot, and anybody who shares his love for the Constitution and his faith, or respect for his faith, is a friend of Phil's, and that will never die. So, thanks very much, guys, and you know, and thanks for letting me talk today and getting a little bit off my chest, and thanks for taking the time to remember a great man. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Loudon. And could I just mention the documentary that Mr. Loudon made reference to earlier was The Enemies Within: Communists, Socialists, and the Progressives in the U.S. And it's available on Amazon.com. This, of course, being the first day of the lockdown in Minnesota, you may not get your Amazon.com deliveries on time, but
you can see it on Amazon Prime. It's at 2 million views on Amazon Prime now.
Brilliant. Amazon Prime. I'm a subscriber. I need to look that up. I have a hard copy too.
Yeah, we've had that on for a little while, but 2 million copies, so 2 million views, more than 2 million, which, you know, 2 million people have seen Phil through that movie. You know, at least.
Share your preferred social media if you have a .com, or if you have a way you want people to follow you, whether it's a YouTube channel or do you have a Twitter account?
Yeah, I have a Twitter account. Just look up Trevor Loudon. I have a daily blog, trevorloudon.com, and I have a new book out. You can go there and see it. It's advertised there. White House Reds, Communists, Socialists, and Security Risks Standing for US President 2020. So that really gets into the red and green behind all the Democratic candidates who have stood and are still in the field. So, but, you know...
we'll be sure to include all that below this video when it's sent out to everyone, so people will be able to make contact with you and see your work.
Yeah, well, that's great, and thank you, Wes. We got to go on. We got to keep on the fight, and that means advertising our stuff and reaching out to people. But I'm really glad to have done this. It was good to actually verbalize stuff that had been floating around in my head for a while, and it's all part of the grieving process. And I can't wait till we learn a bit more about what happened. You know.
Yeah, but we all felt his presence with us. That week after, I felt many memories came flooding back, and I felt the need to do this kind of things to process my grief as well, because the memories came flooding back. So thank you for being part of this, sir.
Oh, pleasure, Wes. No, pleasure. It was a pleasure, you know. And but thank you for giving the opportunity, and thanks to everybody out there watching. All the past friends of Phil and the friends who've discovered him, actually maybe even since he's died. So his memory and his works will live way beyond his years. There's no question about that. When the history of this nation is written in the future, when the true history of a free America is written in the future, he will be down there as a true American hero. I have no doubt about that. Okay.
Brilliant, sir.
Okay. I'll see you later, Wes.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.